for tuning in. And yeah, my name is Zvonimir. I am based in Zagreb in Croatia, but yeah, I've been working remotely for quite some time. And yeah, this is actually my second time at your lovely meetup group because yeah, I guess there's one good thing about the COVID situation. I get to travel around and I did quite some UK-based meetups already. And yeah, enough about me. Let's start with the talk itself. Just need to get Zoom out of the way, and I hope I have it. So, since this is a mostly a UK crowd, and since we are all developers here, I guess there's a reasonable assumption that some of you are fans of science fiction, and then you probably recognize this person. If not, you can kind of zoom into the image a bit because he's kind of holding his own book. So this is Arthur C. Clarke. Arthur C. Clarke is one of the most famous science fiction writers of all time. And some of his most notable works are Rendezvous with Rama, Childhood's End, and 2001 Space Odyssey, which he wrote in parallel with Stanley Kubrick's movie of the same name. Now, one thing that Arthur C. Clarke has said is that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And if you think about it, imagine if you could go back in time and you can bring this thing with you, right? Your mobile phone. Maybe you go like, I don't know, 500 years back in time. People in that period, this technology would be so alien to them that they would assume it's magic, right? And you couldn't blame them. It would be basically a reasonable assumption because it would look so out of touch with the time you are that you would probably assume, or you would also probably assume that this person has some supernatural abilities because they have this thing and there's like a man living in the thing and stuff like that. Now, this kind of situation without the time machine kind of happened in this during the Second World War in these Melanesian islands where the indigenous population up until then lived what you might call like a technology-free life. And then during the Second World War, they first spotted these Japanese airplanes, later Allied airplanes, and also the soldiers, then the Allied forces, they established some military bases on these islands. So the native population there, they got to observe them in their like daily rituals and daily goes. And then when the war ended, right, soldiers finally left home, they left these islands, and interesting phenomena started to occur on these islands. There was these kind of cults appeared, and the leaders of these cults, what they claimed was that those packages that were being thrown from the sky, which were like packages with supplies for the Allied forces, so they would throw them with parachutes, and sometimes they would fall on the ground, and the population there could also see what's inside, and there were food and all different sorts of stuff. So the leaders of these cults, what they claimed is that these packages, these were gifts from gods. And of course, if you follow that particular cult, if you follow that leader, they will be able to summon the gods to throw this cargo once again. And this is why these cults were called cargo cults, because they kind of worship the cargo. And the interesting thing there is that what they did is they would build replicas of these airplanes, and they would also parade with wooden rifles. So you see, they would mimic the behavior they saw from the soldiers who were living there at the time of the Second World War, because they assumed that maybe if they mimic this behavior, the cargo might fall again, right? Now, this kind of behavior, when we as humans, we mimic some other behavior, assuming that there's maybe some connection with some outcome, this is not anything special to the population of these islands. It happens all the time, right? It's actually a very human thing to do, and we see it all the time. And since we, software developers, are also humans, there is a software development version of this cargo cults, and we call it cargo cult programming, right? Wikipedia defines it as ritual inclusion of code or programming structures that serve no real purpose, right? So you are kind of just doing things like everybody else because everybody else is doing it. So you are kind of doing it and you're not sure like why, how it started. You're just mimicking other people's behavior. And you assume that there is some kind of point to this behavior, right? That is not just like a mindless ritual. Now, one of these, in my opinion, programming cargo cults, and one that is very widespread and dear to the hearts of many developers around the world, is the so-called getters and setters, right? So what we do is we write our classes, our entities usually, we put some private properties, and then we immediately write these getters and setters method. So you can set these properties and you can read their values. And this is so widespread that these days, IDEs are giving you usually some shortcuts so you can automatically create these getters and setters, right? So you don't even have to type in the code yourself. Now, as I said, I think this is mostly ritual behavior. And I think that mostly people, when developers do it, they just do it because everybody has been doing it. So they are kind of just mimicking the behavior and they don't really know why are we doing it? Why is the purpose for this? So yeah, maybe you will agree, maybe you disagree. Bear with me until I give you my reasoning, and then we can have a discussion and so on. So I will start with the setters first. And just to be clear, when I say a setter method, I mean something like this, right? So you have a user class, probably some entity. A user has a name, so it's a private property. And then you put this method, you use the prefix set, the property name, which here is the name. And you have, it accepts a string. So you update the name to this new value, right? You assign a new value to the name. Now, I don't have to probably tell you this because you are all mostly native speakers, so you know this better than me. This is not how we speak in English, right? We don't say Mark has set his name to Tony. This kind of operation of changing your name to another name, there is a word to describe this process. It's called renaming, right? So if renaming is what your method does, then why not call it rename, right? Now, functionally, this method is still doing the same thing, but the name of this method now is giving us a much clearer indication of what is the intention behind this method, right? When should you call this method? You should call it when you want to rename a user, right? It is telling us something about what is the behavior of our user in this domain. What are the supported behaviors for a user in our domain? And as a side benefit of this, you get into a situation where this domain concept that we have, which is a user can be renamed, right? In our domain, this is something that happens. Now this domain concept is clearly reflected in your code base. So now when developers and non-developers or the business people or the domain experts, however you wanna call them, when they talk to each other, they have this kind of shared vocabulary that they can use. And they don't have to get into that situation that happens more often than you would like it, where you are talking to some business people and then they say some term and you are like, oh, that thing that they call this, in our code base we call it that, right? So it's kind of like you have to map between apples and oranges all the time. And the more of these mappings you have, the bigger the chance that you will get something wrong. And then you end up in a situation where your code may be right, working properly, but it is not doing the right thing because turns out, right, there was this misunderstanding between you and the business people and vice versa. So using this shared vocabulary, or like in domain-driven design, this is the so-called ubiquitous language. We can bridge this gap of misunderstanding, and when we talk with each other, the domain people and or the non-technical people, or the non-developer people and the developer people, we can get understand each other because we use the same terminology. So this is also a benefit of not using just technical setter methods, but using these kind of, let's call them behavioral methods. Now, before we go to getters, let's take a look at another example of a setter method. And again, I'd say a standard example. We have this class light. Let's say it's an entity for some reason, or it's just a class. Now, a light can either be on and off, right? So we add this Boolean property on, and then we add a setter. So you can set it to on and off, right? Now, again, this is not how we talk, right? We would not say, can you please set the light to off? We would just say, can you please turn off or turn on the light? So again, we will refactor, but this time we will split our setter into two methods, right? One is to turn the light on and one is to turn the light off. Now, again, this concept of a light, you can turn it on, you can turn it off, right? These are the behaviors of our light in our domain. It's clear, much more clearly now. It is clear now. It is clearly expressed in our code, which is great. But there is another benefit now that we gained with this refactoring. And if you remember the light class before we did this refactoring, it had a setter. What our light class was doing, it was basically exposing its internal structure to the outside world, because it was saying, hey, I have this property called on, and you can set it to on and off, like to a Boolean true or false, right? It was exposing its internal state. And this is bad because objects should actually protect their internal state. They should protect their internal structure, internal state, internal data, and they should expose behaviors. While data structures, they expose their data and have little or less or no behavior. And our light class with that setter method, even though it was a class, so when you instantiate it, it would be technically an object, it was behaving more like a data structure. While now our light class is what we might say a proper object, right? Because it is encapsulating, it is protecting its internal state, and it is only exposing behaviors. So the light class now says, you know what, I'm a light, you can turn me on, you can turn me off, but what's gonna happen internally when you turn me off and turn me off, that's, you know, that's my business, right? I will take care of that. You don't need to know, and you shouldn't know what happens internally, right? Whether internally I use a Boolean or maybe, I don't know, array for some reason, that's my thing, right? And again, another benefit here is if we refactor this light class now to use an array instead of a Boolean, again, let's say for some reason we need to, all the code that communicates, that talks to this class doesn't need to be updated because they just use this turn on and turn off methods. While in the example where we use a setter, we would have to update every time, every code line where we call that setter to now pass in an array instead of a Boolean, right? So there's another benefit by this refactoring. And another thing with setters is that when you use exclusively setter methods, you end up with something that is called an anemic domain model. And it's called anemic because there are not a lot of behaviors, right? So your objects end up like data structures. So I guess that's the analogy with the whole anemic word here. So again, let's take a look at one example. And why can this be problematic, right? So we have a user class. It has, let's say, 3 properties, and then we add these setter methods for those 3 properties, right? So how would we use this class? How would we create a user? So yeah, we would instantiate a user. We would then use setters to pass in, you know, to set all the data that makes a valid user, and then we would save it probably with using some repository or maybe with a save method that we are using Laravel's eloquent ORM. So what's the problem here, right? Well, the problem is, you know, on that first line of code, when you create a user, it is already in an invalid state. And I know somebody will now say, well, what's the big deal, right? In the next 3 lines, you just set those, you use the setters and then you get it to a valid state, right? And then you save it, right? So it's not in an invalid state for too long, right? Well, yeah, but what if somebody forgets one setter, right? Somebody forgets to set the address of a user, and then you persist to the database. So now you have an invalid user in your database. And what is even worse, and it's a more subtle bug or a problem that can happen, is somebody could load your user, and then they can use a setter to violate some domain concept. So let's say in our domain, the rule is that a user can only be born once, right? So once you are born, you know, once the user object entity is constructed, it should get a birth date, and then it's immutable, right? You cannot be born twice. But now some reckless or maybe just pure evil developer, right? They can load our user and then can set another birth date and violate this domain concept, and again persist it somewhere along the line, and you end up with an invalid user in your database. So this is problematic, right? So what can we do? Well, of course, we can move to a more rich domain model, and to do that, we will again move away from setters. But we are also going to do something that is even more controversial than not using setters, and that is instead of instantiating an object and then using setters to get it to some valid state, right, to set all that data necessary to have a valid user, we are going to use a constructor. So we are going to use a constructor to construct our user object, right? And not only that, but in our constructor, we're going to say, you know what, to the outside world, right? Whoever wants to create this user, they need to pass in all the data that is needed to construct a valid user when they are calling the constructor, right? So this way, it is impossible to create an invalid user. As soon as you create a user, it has to be in a valid state because we require all the data necessary to have a valid user to be passed in during construction time. And now that this user is constructed, then it is a valid state. We are not just going to expose all these internals via setter methods, but we are going to only expose those behaviors that are supported in this domain. So a user can be renamed. or they can update their address. Maybe I should have used the word move, right? That would be probably more like a domain concept. So now when we use this object, right, this entity, we can only create a valid user because we have to pass in all the data that makes a valid user. And then we cannot use some weird combination of setters to get it to some invalid state. We can only use those behaviors that are supported in our domain. And this way, our user we will make sure that our user is always in a valid state. So when you persist it, it's valid, and that's it, right? And with that, we can move to getters, right? Now, when it comes to getters, so when it comes to setters, I've talked about how we should move away from setters, use these behavior methods and so on. When it comes to getters, I will only talk here about naming getters, right? I will not go into the discussion, should you have getters or not. There are some reasons when in some, let's say in some kind of architectures where you would, there would be reasons why you would not have getters at all in some parts of your code. But again, I will not go into that discussion. I'm talking only about naming your getters here. And again, just to be clear, when I say a getter method, I mean something like this, right? Again, a user has an address. So you put the get prefix, you put the name of the property address, and then you return this address, right? And again, what's problematic here? Why would this be a problem? We have been, whenever I come to some company, everybody does it. It's so widespread. Like, why would you even think about changing it, right? Well, again, first of all, let's try to remember some situation where in real life you needed to reveal some personal information about you, right? Maybe you were in a bank and you needed to give them your address. Did the bank clerk said, get me your address, or did they just say, address, name, phone number, right, with a question mark? So again, we can just ditch the get prefix, and I say we lose no information in the process. And again, I know somebody is now jumping out of their seats and saying, how do you mean we don't lose any information? We don't have the get prefix. We don't know what this method does, right? The get prefix is telling us it is returning the address. Well, actually, I would say that there is the get prefix. So the get prefix is a convention, right? There's this convention that if there is a get prefix, it's a getter, so it returns the value of the property, which you just read like what comes after the get, which is address here. And conventions are good, but there is something even better than a convention, and that is a language construct, right? And there is a language construct here that is telling us, and in fact, it's not only telling us, it is guaranteeing us that this method returns an address, and that is the return type, right? The return types are there. That's what they are there for. The return type is telling you and guaranteeing that this method returns an address. And when you look at the method and then you see that the name of the method is address, that's a pretty good indicator. It will return an address, and then you see the return type, and you can be sure that it returns an address. So now adding the get prefix here gives you, adds no new information. So it's just noise, and you should remove it. You should remove noise from your code. Now, some of you are maybe old enough to remember back in the days, PHP didn't have public private keywords or protected, the access modifiers. I think it came in PHP 5.4 or something like that. But what people did back then, they had a convention. So they said, there's no way for us to make a method private because there's no private keyword, but we are going to use this underscore prefix in the name of our method to indicate to other developers that this method should be private, right? And then if the other developers are going to behave nicely, they will not call this method from the outside, right? And this was okay, right? Because what can you do if there's a missing language feature, then or language construct, then a convention is the next best thing. But then PHP 5 came along, introduced these access modifiers, so you can actually define the method as a protected or private, and then you couldn't call it from the outside. It was impossible to do, and that was much better than this convention. So slowly that convention disappeared, and you can still sometimes see it in some old code bases. And if you ever wondered why it is there, yeah, now you know. And I'd say that before we had return types in PHP, you could argue that the get prefix, the convention of a get prefix, also had its purpose. But now that we do have return types in PHP, there is no need to add the get prefix to your getters. It's just noise, and we should just remove that convention the same as we did with the whole underscore prefix for methods. Another thing about the get prefix and using these getters and using the get prefix in getter methods is there's also this kind of misalignment or discrepancy of how we use when we use the word get in English language and the way we think about getters in software development, right? So let's imagine, you know, I asked my girlfriend, you know, hey, can you get me a beer out of the fridge, right? And I mean, she would probably tell me, you know, get yourself your own beer, you lazy developer. But yeah, let's imagine she just gets me one beer, and there's a consequence to this action, right? And every time she gets me a beer, or I go and get a beer myself out of the fridge, there is a consequence and a side effect of that, right? The side effect is there is one beer less in the fridge, right? And eventually the fridge will be out of beers. And I admit I would like that the fridge obeys this idea that we as developers have, that calling a getter on an object doesn't change the internal state of that object. But in real life, when you say, get me the keys of the car, when you get something, there's a side effect, always something changes. So there is this kind of discrepancy, again, as I said, how we think about getters in software development, and even how the word, you know, when we are getting something in real life, how we use this terminology. And then sometimes when getters do have side effects, it can lead to some nasty bugs as well. Okay, so now finally, what am I saying? Am I saying you should never, ever use getters and setters? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that next time when you are, you know, just going to push that button to automatically create getters and setters, maybe you can stop, think about it. Maybe you can move to a more, you know, you can change your setters to be like move them towards more of like a rich domain model, where you use your constructor to construct your entities in a valid state, and you only expose behavior methods, behaviors that are supported in your domain. And when it comes to the getters, maybe you can, you know, teach the get prefix, rely on the use return types as well, of course. And yeah, maybe you will see how it goes. Maybe you come to like it. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for tuning in. And if you have questions, I believe, yeah, we have time for that.